This is the Pace 500.3. It's the newly updated city cruiser model from Aventon. It's got some upgrades from the previous version of the bike, so let's take a ride and find out what those are. Before we get started, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. We really appreciate the support and we want to be able to help you find an awesome e-bike that's just right for you. So the Pace 500 has been around for a while. This is the third iteration of the bike. We've been a pretty big fan of the previous versions and it seems like a lot of other people have been too. This is one of Aventon's most popular e-bikes. I think they did some really awesome things with the 500.3 that they've also been including on their other new or updated bikes. The most important thing is that they changed the type of sensor that tells the motor to turn on. The old version of the bike used a cadence sensor, which worked just fine, but this bike now uses a torque sensor, and I really liked how this responded to my amount of effort. I got more power from the motor when I pedaled harder or faster. We throw around the terms natural and responsive a lot, and basically those things just mean that you get power where and when you need it, no matter what. The previous version of the bike started a nice trend of putting tail lights and brake lights on the seat stays. This version took that idea and added a little bit more to it. There are now turn signals included with the tail lights here. Those are activated with the buttons on the bike's control panel and they're nice and bright, and I really liked that I could keep both hands on the bar but still signal to other people on the road. That's just an extra layer of safety. Those are the big new things on the Pace that stood out to me, but there's a really big feature that hasn't changed, and that's just how comfortable this bike is to ride and use. A lot of that comes down to the bike's weight and its geometry. I really liked how I was able to sit up straight, which was just comfortable overall, but it also gave me a wide view of everything around me. That kind of positioning also made me a lot more visible to other people on the road, which I really liked. I'm personally not usually the biggest fan of cruiser-style bikes, but there's a lot that I really grew to enjoy about this one, and actually a couple of things included here that I wish I could see more often on other bikes. I'll save that stuff for later though, so for now, let's get into the nitty-gritty and take a look at all the specs and components on this bike. So aside from those big changes that I talked about earlier, all of the major specs and components on the bike are the same on the 500.3 as they were on the 0.2. There's a 48 volt, 500 watt rear hub motor that I really like just because it felt more powerful and fun than I expected. The battery that powers the motor is a 48 volt, 614 watt hour battery that's nice and integrated into the down tube. It's pretty seamless, but it's still removable if you want to bring it inside and charge it too. I was happy to see Tektro hydraulic disc brakes with 180mm rotors on both wheels. This is the E350 series, if you keep track of that stuff. We've seen these a lot recently and they do a really nice job. The bike has an 8-speed drivetrain with a 48-tooth chainring and a 12 to 32-tooth cassette. That's a Shimano Altus system, and it's a pretty common setup that we've seen frequently. I think it does a good job of providing enough flexibility to let you pedal uphill, but also go pretty fast on flat ground. The saddle on this bike is a little bit different from most of the Aventon models. This one is a little more padded and a little more rounded, which goes with the cruiser style design of the Pace. Not my personal favorite, but I get why they chose to use it. The wheels are 27.5 inch with 2.1 inch diameter tires that are puncture resistant, and these are definitely meant for riding on the street. You might think with such big wheels that this bike wouldn't be all that maneuverable, but it's actually able to zip around a lot better than many of the other bikes we've tested. Part of that has to do with the bike's weight, which is right around 52 pounds, but the other part is related to the handlebars. I'm generally not a big fan of this style of swept back handlebar because of some wrist issues that I have, but in this case, I really liked how much leverage they gave me for steering. They did feel a little bit narrow to me overall, but with these nice ergonomic grips, I was able to push down on the supportive wing section, and that kind of helped guide the bike in the direction that I wanted it to go. Now, this bike has a pretty widely adjustable stem, so I was able to set the height and reach distance of the handlebars to really get a good personalized fit. The Pace 500 does come with 2 frame sizes, but this stem gives you a bit of additional flexibility that I was really happy to see. The left handlebar has the bike's throttle lever and control panel, so those are both easy to reach. The Shimano shifter is on the right handlebar, and that's an under the bar trigger style shifter that I found to be pretty comfortable to operate. The display on the bike is the standard Aventon model. It's a full color display. We tend to like it, although maybe it was just this time of year. We do live in the sunny desert, but when I was on my test rides and wearing sunglasses, I actually had a fairly tough time seeing the screen, even with it set to its highest brightness level. Last thing here, you get a little headlight on this bike, and I actually like that it mounts right on the front of the handlebars. It's a bit brighter than I thought it would be given its size, but it's just really good to have. That covers just about everything on the Pace 500. It's a fairly simple setup, so let's dive into our test results and see how the bike performed. The Pace performed well on our brake test. We ended up with an average stopping distance of 20 feet 5 inches. This was about 6 inches longer than we measured on the step-through version of the bike, which we also tested recently, and I think that just goes to show that this test isn't perfect, but it does give us a ballpark figure to work with. So overall, this bike did better than average by about a foot, which is great. I mentioned that the Pace has Tektro hydraulic disc brakes with 180mm rotors, so we didn't really expect anything less. The reason we do this test is to make sure that the brakes are effective and safe, and overall I think the Pace checks those boxes, but there is one thing I want to bring up before moving on. When I took this bike out for testing, I had to dodge a bunch of lizards on the bike paths here. We live in southern Utah, and they're everywhere this time of year. But there were a handful of times that I had to react really quickly and sort of slam on the brakes to avoid hitting them as they ran in front of the bike. And there were a few instances where the bike almost slid out of control, and I think that was mostly because of the tread pattern on the tires. I don't think the setup here is unsafe at all, but I would recommend practicing and getting a feel for how the bike handles when you find yourself in a tricky spot like that. So if you find yourself having the same problem, you might want to put on different tires with a bit of a heavier tread, and ultimately I think that would be a really nice thing for Aventon to at least offer when you're purchasing the bike. So we've noticed some patterns with Aventon bikes that showed up on the Pace 500 as well. Overall, it did really well on our circuit test where we're analyzing a bike's speed, and we learned that it could be pretty fast if we wanted it to be, but that we also needed to work a bit for that. We tested the bike both in its Class 2 and Class 3 settings, and the data we saw was pretty similar in both modes. I noticed a lot of help from the motor even in the bike's lowest pedal assist setting, which is Eco mode. That's one part of the pattern that we've seen with Aventon bikes, and the other is that there's a pretty even distribution of power between all of the PAS settings, but the differences are sort of hard to feel because that initial jump is so big. So basically with the new torque sensor, we were able to get at least as much power back from the motor as we were putting in, but even in Class 3 mode, I noticed that it wasn't very easy to get up to the limit of 28 miles per hour without some serious legwork. I found it most comfortable to stay around 24 or 25 miles an hour, but if I really wanted that extra little bit of speed, then I could get there just with a bit of faster pedaling. I do think it's nice that Eco mode actually makes a really big difference here. It was nice to be able to stay in that setting to save on battery power, but also get a good amount of output from the motor. But that said, we'd prefer to see that initial amount of power brought back down a little bit so the rest can be balanced out a bit more. Then the differences between the bike settings could feel a little more meaningful. The Pace 500 did great in our range test. We figured out that you can expect to travel between about 35 and 68 miles depending on what pedal assist setting you're in and how much power the motor is drawing from the battery. The results we got are pretty solid on their own, but we were actually able to exceed the range that Aventon advertises for the bike, so I was pretty excited about that. They suggest you can go up to 60 miles in eco mode, and obviously we were able to go a little farther. So that's another benefit of the new torque sensor on this bike. It made us do a little bit more of the work, but it didn't eat through the battery so quickly because of that. And this version of the bike did way better here than the older model as well. We got between 15 and 65% better range depending on what setting we used. We went between about 2 and 5 hours on the bike depending on setting 2, so I'd say that if you're able to keep it in eco mode, you can expect to get a lot of time on the bike before you'll need to recharge. When it comes to our hill test, this bike did pretty well, but that also needs some context. If you're just looking on paper and comparing this to bigger, more powerful bikes, then its results probably aren't going to look that great. And also, at least in our experience, a big part of what makes a bike good or not is how it feels, not just necessarily how it measures up by the numbers. When we pedaled the bike in turbo mode, we measured 1 minute and 28 seconds and an average speed of 12.3 miles per hour from the bottom to the top of our test hill. Using only the throttle, it took 2 minutes and 5 seconds with an average of 8.7 miles per hour. Keep in mind, it's pretty common for throttle results to be a little bit worse, but both of those times are fairly slow when compared to similar bikes. The pool of bikes that we have to compare to here isn't huge though, so that could change as we test more that are similar. But more importantly, this version of the bike did way better than the previous version. The old model wasn't even able to make it up the hill with just its throttle, and our time was a good deal faster when pedaling on the new bike too. Bottom line, I think it actually felt really good on hills. I mentioned how powerful it can feel even in eco mode, and I think that really comes into play the most uphill. I found it to be pretty comfortable to pedal even on smaller hills in the lowest setting, but even bigger ones were pretty easy for me in sport or turbo modes. I mentioned earlier that I'm not usually a big fan of cruiser style e-bikes, so if I'm being honest, I wasn't necessarily looking forward to testing the Pace 500.3, but after really spending some time with it and seeing not only how it performed, but just actually how it felt to ride, I actually really like this bike. In my experience, Aventon seems to do a really great job in general, but this bike blends the best parts from a few different styles together. It's not super heavy, so you can move it around a little bit easier. Most of the time it feels a bit more powerful than it actually is. And in general, it's just a really comfortable bike. The thing that impressed me the most was its maneuverability. That made it a lot of fun to ride and test. But obviously the big upgrades here are really important too. With the torque sensor, you end up with just a better feeling bike because of how responsive it is, and that also gives you the potential for really great range. And of course, I think it's just important to give Aventon props for including turn signals here. I really hope that we start seeing other brands doing this more often. From my personal experience, I might prefer to see tires with a little bit of a heavier tread pattern for more stable braking, and I think the display could potentially use an extra brightness level or two for when you're riding in direct sunlight, but tires are a pretty simple thing to swap out if needed, and when it comes to the display, you can always just use your phone with the Aventon app. Otherwise, I completely understand why this is one of Aventon's most popular bikes. It offers a lot at a good price, it looks good, and I think it's going to be a great fit if you just want a good bike to ride to work or cruise around in the evenings or weekends. I want to say a quick thank you for hanging out with me today. We'll leave a link to our written review in the video description. That's going to go into a bit more detail than we covered here, so please check that out. We'll also leave a link to the Aventon website so you can take a look at the Pace 500 for yourself. Please use that link if you decide to make a purchase. That helps support us, and it also doesn't cost you anything extra. And again, please hit those like and subscribe buttons below and let us know what you think about this bike in the comments section. That's all for today. I'm John with Electric Bike Report, and this is the Aventon Pace 500.3.